we all want to live conscious lives. We all want to make better decisions than bad decisions. And so I think for those people that are thinking about that as it relates to apparel, it's a good one because the apparel industry is really bad. It's got tons and tons of waste attached to it and lots of inconsistent adherence to standards that are probably worth talking about if you care about it. We obviously at American Giant care about that a lot. We think it's a really, really big problem in the industry as a whole. But so you mentioned some statistics. So let me give a little bit of history to it. So about 40 years ago, around 1980, something like 95% or more of the clothing that Americans purchased were made in the U.S. And that meant a very robust textile and apparel industry in the United States. And the nice thing about that, like a lot of lower skilled jobs, is they provide really important glue to communities, urban communities and rural communities. And those are communities that often need them for people that maybe don't go on to have college or graduate degrees, but want to have good, reliable jobs for their families. They provided a very large employment base for people that were coming out of high school or with trade degrees or wanted to work in the trades, to have good, viable, long-term jobs. At about that time, we began to create trade deals internationally, NAFTA being one, that began to open up trade with Central and South America and Asia that were essentially the concept was quite straightforward, which is we will be able to access cheaper labor and lower regulations, and that'll translate into more choice for the American consumer at cheaper prices. That is all true. That all is exactly what bore out. There was another target there too, which was a belief that as we began to trade with China in particular, that trading relationship over time would have a moderating effect on China. It would bring China into the first world. And China would become a world player in the first world and share of value systems and become a force for good in the world. What happened was two things. I think on the consumer side of things, that prediction bore out. What wasn't really thought about was when you do that and you evaporate all the jobs that went along with an increasing posture towards free trade. That had a tremendous hollowing out effect on communities, rural and urban communities. And when those jobs go away and they're replaced with social programs or joblessness or a combination of those things, bad things fill in. I mean, you really have, if you care about inner cities or you care about rural America, it's the same problem. But you've got narcotics moving in, you've got people that aren't working, you've got particularly young men that aren't working. And that becomes a really difficult challenge that is measured by, isn't maybe solved by having central air conditioning or a flat screen TV. That if you've got a bunch of people that aren't working and that are living in communities that are decaying, that translates into a lot of hopelessness. And I think you see that in, you look at the trend lines in the United States, they're discouraging. Young men aren't working. There's increasing levels of addiction and suicide and depression rates. And I personally tether a lot of that back to not doing a good job as a country to provide good entry-level jobs to people that need them and that want them. Mm-hmm. So that's one big piece. And the other big miscalculation in my mind is that China today is a much more intractable foe than it was 40 years ago. A much richer country today, arguably is more competitive from manufacturing and military standpoint than we are. I view it as kind of a massive wealth transfer, and that we've just made a really bad foreign policy decision. And so I think our job as business leaders is to provide alternatives to customers. I don't think it's enough to ask customers sort of in a finger wagging manner to say, you need to do better, you need to have better choices. I think we all collectively, I think policymakers need to play a role. Us business leaders need to provide good, viable alternatives to customers. And I think that they too have to sort of be mindful of, in this particular area of my life, wherever that might be, I'm going to vote with my values. And that could be, as we discussed, it could be in food, it could be on vacations, it could be on the car you drive, the clothes, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. But give consumers the choice where they can make informed decisions in maybe a better way. The final thing, I'll just end on a couple of statistics that you mentioned on this that you might find interesting. So in 1980, the average American family spent about $1,600 in today's dollars on clothes and shoes. And that represented about 65 items. Today, the average American family spends almost the same, about $1,600 on clothes and shoes, but it represents about 180 items. So there's been a fundamental shift in that category towards cheaper items, much more items and cheaper items. And I think we all intuitively get that. It's like, yeah, it's true. My parents, or when I was very young, we had fewer, better quality things. Great flannel shirts, great sweatshirts, great jeans that lasted for a long time. Yeah. And now I buy a pair of jeans and they seem to fall apart within 6 months, and my shoes don't last, and my flannel shirt's junky. And then the other thing to sort of end on a discouraging note, the average American family throws away about 80 pounds of clothing a year. So it really is this disposable stuff. Now, again, I don't want to. That's
insane. I mean, if you think about 80 pounds,
it's a little crazy. It's a little crazy. I think now, to avoid the finger wagging part of it, I think, I'm not sure that consumers have been given a great choice. And so, as you mentioned earlier on, we want to make really good quality stuff that's going to last, stuff that you don't have to replace. Make it in a way that you can feel really good, feel like you're contributing to helping out neighbors and communities that need jobs. And then put it out there for consumers to decide, does that make sense to me or not? And I think, I hope that we're going to see that everywhere. You're certainly doing that in food. And I think providing consumers with good choices is a great way, I think, to take a step in the right direction. Because at least in apparel, there have been very few brands that have done that well over the last 30 years or so. So tough for consumers to make good decisions there, I think, oftentimes.